And good day to you, BSAM. Good day to you, BSAM. This is Dejan Sneed of Zoom Studios in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to the Speculative Futures and the Black Fantastic. And from your Southern Country cohort here in BSAM, Atlanta, I'd love to welcome you to my space of Generative Afrofuturism 2.0, talking about Black visions of design thinking, and would love to showcase a brief but succinct introduction to some of our efforts. It's here at Subsume. So for us at Subsume and who I am, we'll get to a deeper detail, but looking at how we can leverage the spaces of creativity, technology, and community to make sure that we're all part of an equitable and sustainable Black future. And so I'd love to go ahead and bring to the stage my humble presentation today as part of the gathering there in Senegal. Though I'm not there with you in physical form, spiritually, and very enviously happy to be a part of the overall endeavor. So, With that, we'd love to showcase a small presentation here called Generative Afrofuturism 2.0, Black Visions of Design Thinking. And as always, here at Subsume, we're looking at the idea of shared futures. The future is not being linear but exponential in a space of creativity, technology, and community. So let us kind of proceed onward from there. So, first of all, who am I and why am I here on this small or medium screen? Continue to where you are. My name is Dejan Sneed, based here in Atlanta, Georgia, and founder of Subsume. And from that, just a humble creative technologist born in Snow Hill, North Carolina, an artist, futurist, social entrepreneur, and creative technologist. I have the privilege of being a Ford Foundational Fellow in Gaming and Artificial Intelligence for Educational and Workforce Development. And at the end of the day, I'm just a huge nerd and love the idea of fantasy, Afrofuturism, speculative fiction, but leveraging that as a space for education and workforce development is what we do at Subsume. So using gaming as a precursor to demystify, but also to engage in spaces of education has always been a part of our roadmap. But seeing ourselves represented with agency and authority and technology as the underpinning but overarching goal is what we're working on there. So when we talk about futurism and being a futurist, I like to have this as a simple exercise to warm us up. So I wanted to ask if you've ever noticed anything really from perhaps an old movie, a book, or maybe your own personal idea that at the time was fantastic, did not exist, could not exist in the ways that the world were at that point, and eventually in your time and on your timeline came to life. From that, we get the spaces of futurism, and so a a real, and I'm going to probably use the word only once, poignant uh, representation of that is Star Trek. And so, in the 1960s, science fiction coming on the screen. We have in 1966 James T. Kirk of the USS Enterprise with a crew that boldly goes where no one has gone before. And in that, there was a device, a technology that did not exist. It was fantastic at the time, the Star Trek communicator, and it was a device, a handheld wireless device that Captain Kirk or anyone that had it could talk to someone else, not only in the next room, but across the ship and across different planets. The idea was that this was a communication device that simply did not exist in the technical capacities of the 1960s. And so it did not stop the in the space of innovation because a young boy named Martin Cooper watched this television show, was a big fan, and he was obsessed with making this device in the real world. And so eventually he became an engineer and worked at Motorola and developed the very first mobile phone call in history in the mid 1970s. So for 10 years, he worked on creating this device. And so through different iterations, not only did he become the first person to place a cell call and is considered the pioneer of cellular technology, mobile cellular technology, he actually invented the StarTAC. And if we look at the design, the flip phone components, and the name itself, StarTAC being a homage to Star Trek, this phone sold 1 million copies and is really set to be the precursor to what we consider just worldwide adoption to mobile technology. So for this is a space of something being fantastic in the 1960s, been developed in the 1970s because it was a visual representation of such, and then being a practical and worldwide phenomenon from the 90s and beyond. And so with futurism, what we're saying is what is imagined can come to be, and from there we step into the space of the realities we're looking to create in the space of Afrofuturism. Now, and we'll say that blackness in the speculative forever, and of course, using this as a artistic representation of Wakanda. Now, I know that from Wakanda and Black Panther is we'll say, a generalized space of Afrofuturism. And ideally, watching this being gathered in Senegal and spaces around the world, we have a myriad of expertise in arts, tech, culture, and as Afrofuturism in actual practice. We want to use a very general example of that for us to start. So, for Blackness and Speculative Forever, we are speaking to Afrofuturism as a vehicle, as a technology for Blackness to exist in that future. So, the same way that we think of futurism, of what was imagined, can come to be, we're looking at Afrofuturism as being able to imagine ourselves, our culture, our narratives across the African diaspora as being able to also exist based off of our creative design. And so, what we understand from futurism in some is that creativity makes realities. And the stories that we create today manifest of tomorrow, a linear, if not exponential, version of our tomorrows together. And so, we have to create our own stories. We have to honor and cherish our narratives so that those tomorrows can truly manifest. And so, examples of Black Panther, where you have a comic book from the Marvel Comics being able to be not only a billion-dollar franchise, showcasing the viability financially or commercially of Black stories, but also the cultural resonance that happened globally. And so from there, we also have the stories of, say, Octavia Butler, the musical stylings of Sun Ra and Janelle Monáe, both as cultural auteurs, artistic visionaries, but also musical geniuses. And from there, this is a space where we can see Afrofuturism in action, being able to build and develop those types of expertise. And so, using that same example of Star Trek from a James T. Kirk, let's look at the timeless Nichelle Nichols, who portrayed Lieutenant Uhuru on the same show in 1966. Of course, the reality of being a Black woman in the 1960s was complex to say the least. The same relationships and narratives that were maybe afforded to William Shatner as James T. Kirk absolutely were even more fantastic for Lieutenant Uhuru as a communications officer. So, in that space, the representation across media for Black people, particularly for Black women, limited at best, stereotypical at most, and really the idea of Black people in space when literally there were fights for civil rights and equality um, were as as big a gap as we could probably imagine. And so, what we were looking at in this space is that the representation of Nichelle Nichols, not only an articulate and intelligent, but multifaceted crew member, was part of the Black Fantastic at that time. Of course, the famous notation of Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King being a fan of the show, but also understanding the importance of Nichols' role on Star Trek being a representation that there was a future that Black people would progress, would have access and agency, was critically important. And so after the run of that series, she was actually recruited by NASA to be a representation, and of course here on Earth, of how we could build that future together. So very similarly, she was used to showcase not only the expertise but the availability of women engineers that could be recruited to NASA to make a space for women in space. And so from that, we got the amazing Dr. Mae Jemison that we have pictured, or Sally Ride in a lineage of women engineers and astronauts that were built off of that program. And so, in full circle, of course, Dr. Mae Jemison was also on Star Trek: Next Generation as a character, and so that shows not only the 180, um, but really a 360 because it comes right back to the full circle narrative of something fantastic in the 1960s, being able to make actionable scientific moves in the 1970s, but then from the 80s and 90s, being able to create a space of reality. So, what was fantastic then being a reality now. So, looking at how we as Subsume can continue to build on that legacy, we understand that media has an impact on what we can create as humanity in real world results. So for us at Subsume, we look at digital media as a mode of learning. So if we look at, for example, the space of comics, not only as an art form, but also as a communication and learning module, we see that we can leverage that same technology to build the futures that we want to see. And so, for a fun fact, is that New York Public Schools here currently is one of America's largest comic book publishers. The idea of being able to combat literacy across different avenues is something that's being shown as successful. And being able to teach kids things as comic books, cartoon animations, and short films, also as a precursor to STEM learning and education, works in complement by being able to meet people where they are and being able to be a scalable and sustainable mode of learning. So anything that you can put into a book and have it where it represents someone, but also is a multifaceted mode of learning. Of course, that leads to positive retention in the space where people can see themselves be a part of that future. So for us at Subsume, we have a comic book series called The Temporal Tenth. And so what we're looking at working through this is that we have history, science fiction, and data science put together into a Black Fantastic speculative fiction series based on our based on our thesis that again these creativities can make realities, and that representation matters. And so the premise of the Temporal Tenth as both a science fiction series, but also as a learning module for students, teachers, and stakeholders, is that there's a secret society of hidden figures that throughout Black history have discovered time travel and travel back through time to reinvent their past. With W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington at the founding of the Tuskegee Institute, have a copy of H.G. Wells' Time Machine and endeavor to build that machine. And across the founding of the HBC network that we have here in America, the historical figures, past, present, and future of Black culture, there's a secret society that has been building this machine. And once they get it working, now we have a new change of the game. But with students, they're learning Black history, both hidden and prominent. And from our readers, they get to learn along as well. And so having Morehouse College be represented for young readers in middle and high school is important because that's how we make the men of Morehouse. And from there, we'll showcase that through a new series that right now have our first issue book, but we'll have much more of that to come. And so we also understand that education matters. Being able to have practical dialogue and discourse, particularly in a space where we have generative AI and generative education being more integrated in the classrooms, as well as we see the commodification of information also being that is a civic and is a civic issue of our time. And so what we've done at the back of our book is we've taken professional papers from some prominent educators, spaces that we understand need to be a part of the dialogue, particularly as we're building critical skills and learning in the youth, and giving, instead of a large dissertation of 40, 50, 100 pages, we break these down into stackable one-size pages for readers. So, for example, Dr. Justin Ballinger at Morehouse College been able to introduce what is data science and why is that important for humanities to understand how data matters in their ecosystem. Whether you're an artist, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a politician, we're all driven by data. And so understanding how data science as a skill set can help make you a more responsible citizen, as well as understanding that Black history is history. And so we want to thank Dr. Jonathan Gales, professor and chair of African American Studies at Georgia State, for being able to also break down and understand the historical context of where we're living now, but also that the history and narratives of Black history is to be understood, enjoyed, and appreciated by everyone, and why building that notion is part of progress for all of humanity. So in the back of our books, we offer an opportunity for that dialogue, for that understanding and context to be made. And then keeping to the technology, we actually have a system where by reading the book and using the QR codes that we have within the book, that you're able to develop a profile for how you want to be a part of the future. And instead of trying to make everyone an engineer or trying to make everyone a coder, from the STEM relationship of science, technology, engineering, and math, focusing on the A of the arts, being able to persuade people as an organizer, being able to help, being able to create, and being able to critically think We look to build these skills and to impair them with real world career paths, such as data scientists, such as educator, that will also allow for people to see themselves as part of that. And this works absolutely and intentionally with the Department of Labor so that we can be practical in building those real skills, but also making it where students can see themselves connected. So this is something that by reading comics, they can see themselves. And this is an example of the back end of that profile that we have created and are continuing to build. And so by showcasing a series where young people can see themselves not only as the protagonists of their own success, but also building an infrastructure and system that's sustainable across um, low, we'll say low technological connectivity in underestimated communities, that we're able to build this program out. And so, looking at how these technologies and systems work in complement to generative AI, understanding that it is the technology of many of our times, particularly for our youth, is going to be a defining technology. So, for example, in OpenAI, which we will presume that most people have had some experience with generative AI, understanding that we have large language models that take impossibly rich data sets and create a generative system, basically that produces assets, whether they're visual or text based, for uh, really for mass consumption and use. And so now everyone has a generative system. Um, have a chance and an opportunity to work with OpenAI on a couple of components. Just simply a screenshot for those that may not have seen of probably of about three OpenAI 3, if I'm not mistaken. I think we're at 5. We are at 5 now. And so trying to understand how OpenAI and these systems work and understand in the space of Afrofuturism. So I've created a very simple prompt, and the prompt meaning that it was just simply a query, the same way that we traditionally would use search for Google or for any other search engine. And I typed in an Afrofuturist enjoys breakfast in space. I'll play this again, see if this will come back. And this uses a system called Sora, and it generated this video. High quality video, but the idea of thinking as a data scientist, thinking as an Afrofuturist, the idea is that we need to understand what made this design, what this particular design entails, what it includes, but also what it does not include. Because we did not prompt or create anything about gender, about race, about culture, the idea is that the data set that Sora uses, when it defined Afrofuturism, it created a black woman. Created a black woman with dreadlocks. It created a dark woman of a particular complexion and a particular body type. And so this is where we want to be curious, but also intentional in how we see things being built. Because we understand that data sets historically have bias, we have to understand and interpret how these biases create and develop visual representations, but also systems of education, systems of civics, systems of politics, meaning that because we don't control the data, we don't control this narrative. So it's hard for us to impact what Sora understands as Afrofuturism if we have never been included in those systems to start. And there's a legacy of reasons and valid reasons why we have not been a part of technology and these technological ecosystems. And so where we won't debate those here. We just want to try to have a curious lens as to how we as Black culture are being defined by technologies, and what can we do about it if there's something that is not representative, is not authentic, or is not sustainable, and how we are able to become and remain the agents of our own stories. And so the idea of this is that we have to always think of technology not as something that is with zeros and ones, something that is an electrical device, something that is only a singular point of use at time in time. So the idea, and let me prompt you as humans to think through this, right? The idea of what's a piece of technology that's transformed the ways that Black communities tell stories, and to just give a very cursory definition of technology. We have here the application of conceptual knowledge to achieve practical goals, especially in a reproducible way. So the idea is that we have a knowledge of understanding that, and we have a goal that we want to achieve. And through this technology, we're able to do that, but also in a reproducible way, meaning that over and over again, we at least get a similar, if not same, result. So trying to just expand the definition of technology from there. So we just want to kind of discuss and think through, how does technology shape storytelling and self-representation? And this is critical if we look back at the previous slide, is that if we don't have a space for self-representation, if we are not the storytellers that whose stories are being heard, then it's hard for us to navigate those technologies from the initial design standpoint. And so, as we always do, and as we've done throughout history for arts integration, we have really leveraged technology in new and defining ways, even if we are not the progenitors, the owners of the original technology. I love to kind of look at technology as spaces of resilience, narrative, and resistance, where we take existing technologies and, as Black culture, see ways to help it redefine and empower Black culture. So, for example, Gordon Parks, who is a historian, a photojournalist, particularly through the civil rights movement, was able to use cameras to portray to America, to the world, the plight, the struggle, but also the promise of Black culture. And so, a lot of times, if we think of the media leading up to the 1960s and even currently, a lot of it is not owned it's owned by a small minority. And so, of course, in the 1940s and the really the advent of the civil rights movement, as we in the world know it, we know that newspapers, and communications, television, it was not showcasing the best, brightest of Black culture, of Black citizenship, and really the struggles that segregation were putting in place. And so Gordon Parks, through use of a camera, was able to capture undisputed realities that showcased the again the promise, but also the pain points that were being addressed in civil rights. For example, the doll test here, where children of all stripes were picking the white doll as beautiful, and the darker hued doll as not so beautiful. And so being able to understand the impact of that type of psychological damage that was being propagated, what that was being put upon, but also systemically built into really a lot of the architecture of America, is that this was a way that we could document and dialogue as a nation to see what only was going on, but what we could do about it. And so, using cameras that we did not create, we're able to leverage that story, and we see that in contemporary times as well. Unfortunately, where we see things such as police brutality, we can think of the digital camcorders being able to have video footage. We think to the unfortunate incidents of say Rodney King, and unfortunately too many named African and diaspora citizens. But understanding that having access to phones and technology, we're able to really have narratives and understanding that before was only just word of mouth or hearsay. So that's just one example of how cameras is being used as a space of resilience and narrative. Secondly, if you think of Grand Wizard Theodore, this young gentleman in the middle, in the Bronx in the 1970s, using record turntables, not for their intended use, but to move and mix beats between records, created the scratch. And that scratch is a foundational component of a new genre and art form called hip hop. They just celebrated just over 50 years of being, but finding it as a subculture of music, finding a way for young people in the inner city and across the world to express themselves. A whole new design and new narrative and new art form was created off of something that already existed. So though many of the records and many of the the technologies that hip hop started with, such as microphones and turntables and amplifiers and mixers, weren't created by black engineers. The idea of taking those and reimagining their use was is one of another technologies that is part of Americana, but part of world culture as we know it. And then thinking more of traditional social media technologies. We think to X, Twitter, however we still want to refer to it. The way that users, particularly black users, have ways of creating their own narratives and subcultures within it. So thinking of Twitter, we understand what Black Twitter is. Being able to have our language, to have our jargon, to have our experiences more documented and implemented, but also spaces of shared conversation. That's not maybe the original design of Twitter as it was in some, but we can see the cultural context of Black people using Twitter as a space of gathering, as a space of understanding, being a technology in and of itself. We see that through TikTok, we call it Black Talk. The idea is that we're able to take these spaces and bring our narratives as a component into that. So again, we want to reimagine our definition of technology, but also how we take things that already exist and remix them for our own spaces of resistance and for Black joy. And so continuing on, the idea of leveraging generative AI in that same Sora tool, I want to showcase a brilliant auteur. Her name is Minnie Atairu, and I want to just give a couple moments. We should be able to hear this, but I want to give a moment as to kind of advise how she is using generative AI to create new images, movies, and narratives using this tool to help manifest her vision of Afrofuturist studies. Thank you, one moment. Let's proceed.
Through my work, I try to counter storytell. My name is Mine. I am an interdisciplinary artist. I'm from Nigeria, and I currently live in New York City. Most of the works I create are mediated through artificial intelligence. I grew up in a patriarchal society, and a lot of the visual vocabulary that permeates Nigeria, even Nigerians in the diaspora like myself, were tuned to this patriarchal agenda. In the case of Mami Wata, a mythological figure in Nigeria, my experience with Mami Wata was through Nollywood movies. They were supernatural horror movies that sought to instill fear about Mami Wata. I had already created portraits using image generation. So when I had the opportunity to use Sora, I became very interested in creating a short film. She's typically depicted as a light-skinned Black woman with straight long hair. Her features are more European than Nigerian, which is interesting. And then she would typically have light beams emitting from her eyes. That's something I really wanted to nail down. And as I started exploring in Sora, my initial prompts were for eye beams, like light shooting out of the figure's eyes. But over time, in refining my prompts, Sora started generating other versions of what the eye could look like, right? And so one version that struck me was this really bright yellow eyes with eyelashes that were also yellow. It was a divergence from my initial prompt, but it also embodied what I was looking for. I'm not confined to this one idea. I just want her to laugh hysterically, so I'm going to type laugh hysterically. We are all artists. I think it's a matter of the access we have to tools, access to time to make the work, and just access to resources to realize your vision.
All right, thank you so very much. And so with that, I think it's a great synopsis of how we can leverage these tools. Let's get back to the show there. Thank you. So it is Mine is a great example of that how generative AI as a tool can help empower human artists to ideate, compare, and really regenerate a return to time to think, to research, to understand, and really redefine what we have as traditional cultural values, as representations in digital media, as well as access and availability to share those stories throughout the world. So there were a lot of points there. Again, the idea of where the systems define and develop things initially, but through a generative journey of artistic understanding, Mine, as the human artist, was able to leverage this tool to continue to build her own stories, her own prompts, but really her own generative creativity as a part of this service. So this is I think the key point that we wanted to work on and work through is that we're able to understand storytelling, human storytelling, as ancestral intelligence. So, in a complement to artificial intelligence that is built off a traditional set or a linear set of data and knowledge, that our storytelling as ancestral intelligence is not included in that system by design, but also by design that gives us a unique perspective and capacity that cannot be duplicated by artificial intelligence alone. And then we understand that culture itself is a technology. And then we look through some of the works here of Dr. Ronaldo Anderson with Afrofuturism and the World Order, Dr. Walter Greason and Tim Fielder with the graphic history of hip hop, and Dr. Susanna M. Morris with the life and times of Octavia Butler, Positive Obsession. These are three contemporary examples of culture being leveraged as technology, which again, if we think of it in the most simple sense, as the application of conceptual knowledge to achieve practical goals, especially in a reproducible way, that we can see that we as storytellers are the space by which we can design a culturally affirmed but also sustainable future. And so, really, in sum, when we're thinking of the space of generative Afrofuturism, that we have a vision, but also a way to design and create the realities we are a part of currently, but also those that we want to share and make as a positive and agentic future by being the agents of our own change. And so, with that, we really just want to conclude by reminding everyone that the future is made up of stories like yours. And it has been an absolute pleasure to take just a bit of time to kind of showcase a few ideas and spaces from what we want to build together at Subsume. Of course, Subsume meaning to just include everyone just as they are in the things that they want to be. And so, for the dreamers there in Senegal, for the makers and the doers, we want to thank you for your time, consideration, and for the Black Speculative Arts Movement, our advocates and allies across the world. We want to thank you all, and again, me personally. Here, just Desmond Sneed at Subsume, just humble and appreciated to be a part of this program. So feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. Not too many Dedrins in the world. It's just Dedrin at LinkedIn. And you can find our work of Afrofuturism in action and building the culture of tomorrow at subsumestudios.com. Thank you so very much for this time and consideration. We appreciate each and every one of you. Stay safe and stay included. And we will see y'all in the future. Thank you and take care.